Lawyers. What was your most epic I rest my case moment? I was representing a tenant in a dispute against a slumlord who had refused to fix anything in the apartment. We're talking mold, a leaking roof, broken heating in the middle of winter. You name it. The landlord's lawyer argued my client had never reported these issues, so they had no obligation to fix them. Cue the moment. I pulled out my stack of printed emails. Not only had my client reported the problems, but he had done so 14 times over 6 months. Even better? One of the responses from the landlord's own email address said, "We are aware of the issue but will not be fixing it. If you don't like it, move out." The judge didn't even let the landlord's lawyer rebut. He looked at them, said, "You had every opportunity to address this. Judgment for the tenant." Boom. I rest my case. Story 2. I was defending a guy accused of shoplifting. The store's security footage was the prosecution's key evidence, but they were weirdly cagey about letting me review it before trial. At trial, the prosecutor plays the tape, pausing dramatically to show my client at the entrance of the store. One problem. The timestamp was 2 hours after my client had been pulled over for a traffic stop 15 miles away. I calmly handed the judge a copy of the citation, which had the exact time and GPS location. The judge turned to the prosecutor and asked, "Did you even check the time on this video?" Prosecutor stammered. Judge sighed. Motion to dismiss granted. Client went from facing jail time to walking out a free man in under 5 minutes. Story 3. Represented a guy in a car accident case. The other driver insisted under oath that my client had run a red light. His insurance company refused to pay damages, claiming my client was at fault. Unfortunately for them, my client's dash cam told a different story. When I played the footage in court, it showed the light was green, and the other driver was the one who actually sped through a red. The best part? As he drove through, the other driver looked right at the camera, and you could see the moment he realized he messed up. Judge stared at the screen, then turned to the other driver and asked, "Do you want to reconsider your testimony?" The guy went silent. His lawyer asked for a recess. 5 minutes later, they agreed to settle. I rest my case. Story 4. Divorce case. Husband claimed he had no money to pay spousal support, said his business was failing, barely making ends meet, blah blah blah. Wife had a feeling he was lying, so we did some digging. Found his secret Instagram account where he had been bragging about his brand new sports car, a luxury vacation, and, best of all, a post captioned, "Finally made my first million." In court, I pulled out printed screenshots and casually handed them over. Husband turned bright red. His lawyer actually facepalmed. Judge didn't even look up. Just said, "Well, Mr. Husband, it seems you can afford support payments after all." I rest my case. Story 5. Defended a guy accused of stealing from his employer. Company claimed he'd been skimming cash from the register for months. Their proof? A spreadsheet the manager had put together showing missing money whenever my client was on shift. I asked a simple question: "Where are the security tapes?" Silence. Turns out they had the footage but never watched it, because the actual thief was the manager who made the spreadsheet. A forensic accountant found the manager had been altering numbers to frame my client while pocketing the money himself. The moment I presented the real financial records, the prosecutor dropped the case and my client walked out free. The manager? He got arrested a week later. I rest my case. Story 6. Represented a woman in a workplace discrimination case. She'd been passed over for promotions multiple times in favor of younger, less qualified male colleagues. The company insisted promotions were based purely on performance and had nothing to do with gender. I requested all internal emails regarding promotions and performance reviews. Buried deep in the email chain, I found a message from the CEO to HR saying, "She's good, but we need someone with more energy. A woman her age isn't a great look for leadership." In court, I handed the printed email to the judge and let him read it in silence. The company's lawyer visibly paled. The judge looked up and said, "I hope you're ready to discuss settlement." They settled for far more than they originally offered. My client walked away vindicated. I rest my case. Story 7. A guy was being sued by his ex-girlfriend, who claimed he owed her $50,000 for a loan she had given him during their relationship. She even had texts of him thanking her for the money. Sounded bad, right? Except my client had kept every receipt and had proof that every dollar she sent him was immediately followed by texts from her saying, "I love spoiling you, and I don't care if you ever pay me back." The best part? She had also posted on social media about how she bought her man a new car and was happy to support him because love isn't about money. When I presented this in court, she tried to argue that the texts were just jokes. The judge simply asked, "So you were lying in these messages, or are you lying now?" Her case fell apart. My client owed her nothing. I rest my case. Story 8. Represented a guy in a dispute with his HOA. They had fined him thousands of dollars for allegedly violating community rules, rules that conveniently didn't exist in any document he had signed. The HOA president was especially aggressive, insisting my client had been warned multiple times. I requested copies of these warnings. They reluctantly handed over a single letter, dated 3 days after they issued the fines. Then came the kicker. I found the HOA's own bylaws, which explicitly stated that no fine could be issued without prior notice and an opportunity to appeal. They had done neither. Judge read the bylaws aloud, turned to the HOA president and said, "Explain to me why I shouldn't rule against you immediately." HOA lawyer mumbled something about clerical errors. The fines were thrown out, and the HOA had to refund my client. I rest my case. Story 9. Big real estate case. A wealthy developer was trying to evict a small business owner from a prime retail location, claiming he had violated his lease by failing to maintain the property. The business owner swore he had made every requested repair, but the developer had refused to acknowledge them. So, I subpoenaed the maintenance requests. Sure enough, my client had reported every issue, and in each case the property management company had responded, "This is the landlord's responsibility." But the real nail in the coffin? The developer had already signed a new lease with a national chain store before even filing for eviction. They had no intention of letting my client fix anything. They just wanted him out. The judge took one look at the evidence and ruled in my client's favor, preventing the eviction. That developer lost a lot of money that day. I rest my case. Story 10. Murder trial. The prosecution had a key eyewitness who claimed to have seen my client commit the crime from their apartment window. Their testimony was detailed, confident, and damning. But something felt off, so I visited the witness's apartment myself, looked out the window, and saw nothing. The view was completely blocked by a massive tree. There was no possible way they could have seen anything from that window. I took pictures and videos, then brought them to court. When I presented the evidence, the courtroom fell silent. The judge asked the witness, "Would you like to explain how you saw through a tree?" The witness stammered, tried to backtrack, but it was too late. The prosecution's case unraveled. My client walked free. I rest my case. Story 11. I was defending a small business owner who was being sued by a former employee for wrongful termination. The employee claimed he had been fired for reporting illegal activities at the company. Sounded serious, until we dug into the details. First, the so-called illegal activities were nothing more than the business refusing to give him extra vacation time he wasn't entitled to. Second, he had been fired for repeatedly stealing from the register, which we had on security footage. In court, the employee's lawyer tried to argue that the footage wasn't clear. I waited for them to finish and then handed the judge another document, a signed confession from the employee himself. Turns out, he had admitted to the theft during the internal investigation and even wrote an apology letter hoping to avoid criminal charges. The employee's lawyer turned to him, looking completely stunned. Judge simply said, "Case dismissed." Oh, and my client filed a counterclaim for defamation. The ex-employee ended up paying damages. I rest my case. Story 12. Divorce trial. Husband was claiming he was too broke to pay spousal support. Said he was barely scraping by, living a simple life, had no assets. His lawyer painted him as a tragic figure, a man who had lost everything. Then I played a little video for the court. The husband had posted a live stream just a few weeks earlier, showing off his brand new house, complete with a home theater, swimming pool, and a garage full of luxury cars. He even bragged, "Divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me. She ain't getting a dime." The judge turned to his lawyer and asked, "Do you wish to continue arguing that your client has no assets?" The lawyer didn't even try. The husband got hit with max spousal support payments and had to pay my client's legal fees. I rest my case. Story 13. A landlord was trying to evict an elderly tenant on a technicality, claimed she had an unauthorized pet, which violated the lease. The pet in question? A registered service dog she needed for mobility assistance. The landlord insisted he never approved the dog and that it was a clear lease violation. Problem for him? We had written approval from him in an email. Better yet, he had approved it 6 months earlier and even responded, "Glad we could accommodate you." In court, I printed out the email and slid it across the table. The judge barely looked at it before turning to the landlord and saying, "Are you seriously trying to evict a disabled tenant after you already approved her service animal?" The landlord tried to backpedal. Judge didn't buy it. Not only was the eviction denied, but the landlord had to pay damages for emotional distress. I rest my case. Story 14. Defended a guy in a hit-and-run case. The prosecution had what seemed like rock-solid evidence. a license plate captured on a traffic camera that matched my client's car. They claimed he had struck a pedestrian and then fled the scene. Only problem? My client was in another state at the time. I pulled up his credit card transactions, which showed he had checked into a hotel 300 miles away that same night. Even better? He had used his phone to unlock the hotel room with a digital key, meaning there was GPS data proving his exact location. But the best part? When I looked closer at the traffic cam footage, I noticed a small but crucial detail. The car in the video had a different bumper sticker than my client's. I pointed it out to the judge, who immediately paused and asked the prosecution if they had anything else. They did not. Case dismissed. The real hit-and-run driver was found later. I rest my case. Story 15. Big corporate fraud case. A company had been accused of cooking their books to defraud investors. Their CEO testified that their financials were fully transparent and that they had disclosed everything to shareholders. I had one simple question for him. Then why does this version of your earnings report show a $10 million discrepancy compared to the one given to investors? Silence. Turns out they had been running two sets of books, one real, one fake. And I had both. The CEO stammered, tried to explain, but the judge cut him off, ordered an immediate forensic audit. The company crumbled, investors sued, and the CEO. He later faced criminal charges. I rest my case. Story 16. I represented a man being sued by his former business partner, who claimed he had been unfairly cut out of a multi-million-dollar deal. The plaintiff had a long emotional testimony about how my client had betrayed him and stolen his rightful share of the company. He even had a contract, well, part of one. See, the contract he presented had been heavily edited. Pages were missing, signatures were mysteriously absent, and something just felt off. So I did some digging and found the real contract, the full, unaltered version. And guess what? The plaintiff had voluntarily sold his share of the company 2 years prior. He had been paid in full and even signed a notarized agreement confirming he had no further claims against my client. I slid the real contract across the table in court. The judge took one look at it, turned to the plaintiff and asked, "Did you forget you signed this?" His face went pale. His lawyer asked for a recess. They dropped the case. I rest my case. Story 17. A woman hired me after her insurance company refused to pay out her life insurance claim following her husband's unexpected death. The company insisted that her husband had a pre-existing condition and that he had failed to disclose it when he got the policy. Except there was no pre-existing condition. In fact, he had gone through a full medical screening when he signed up for the policy, and the insurance company had approved him. They were just trying to weasel out of paying. I requested their internal emails and found something interesting, an email from one of their claims adjusters saying, "We should fight this. Most people give up after a few denials." The judge was not amused. He ordered the insurance company to pay the full policy amount, plus interest, plus attorney's fees. My client walked out with every penny she was owed. I rest my case. Story 18. Defended a restaurant owner in a lawsuit filed by a customer who claimed she had suffered severe burns from a hot cup of coffee. She demanded a massive settlement, saying the restaurant had been negligent in serving coffee at a dangerous temperature. But here's the thing. The customer had ordered iced coffee. We had security footage showing her picking up her drink, taking a sip, and then, this was the best part, dumping the coffee on her own lap while looking around to make sure someone was watching. She then immediately started screaming for the manager. When I played the footage in court, the judge literally sighed and rubbed his temples. Her lawyer tried to salvage things, but there was nothing to argue. The case was dismissed immediately, and the judge hinted that she might be facing fraud charges. I rest my case. Story 19. A young man was accused of burglary. The police claimed they had a solid case. An eyewitness identified him, and he had a previous minor offense on his record. They painted him as a repeat offender. But there was a problem. My client had an airtight alibi. He had been at a dentist's office during the burglary. The dentist's office had time-stamped records, a signed procedure note, and even x-rays proving he was in the chair at the exact time of the crime. I presented all of this in court. The prosecutor still tried to argue that maybe he had time to commit the crime before or after his appointment. But then the dentist himself testified that my client had been under anesthesia for nearly 2 hours. The judge stopped the trial right there. Case dismissed. My client walked free. I rest my case. Story 20. Represented a woman in a custody battle against her ex-husband, who was trying to paint her as an unfit mother to gain full custody of their kids. He claimed she was irresponsible, unemployed, and had no stable home. Then I pulled out his financial records. Turns out he had been lying about his own situation. He was $100,000 in debt, had recently lost his job, and had a history of skipping child support payments. Even better, his own social media betrayed him. While claiming to be a devoted father, he had been posting pictures of himself partying in Vegas, bragging about dodging responsibility. The judge took one look at the evidence and awarded my client full custody. The ex-husband was given supervised visitation and ordered to pay overdue child support. I rest my case. Story 21. I was defending a construction company being sued for damaging a neighboring property during a project. The plaintiff, a wealthy homeowner, claimed that my client's crew had caused massive cracks in his foundation, demanding a six-figure payout. He had pictures, a structural engineer's report, and an air of absolute confidence in court. But here's where things unraveled. I hired an independent structural engineer to assess the damage, and he found something interesting. The cracks in the plaintiff's home were years old. How did we know? Because the plaintiff had previously filed an insurance claim for the exact same damage. Then came the real bombshell. I subpoenaed his home repair invoices. He had already been paid out by his insurance company for the damage 5 years earlier and had never repaired it. The judge stared at him for a long moment and asked, "Did you forget about this claim?" His lawyer immediately asked for a settlement discussion. Case dismissed. I rest my case. Story 22. My client, a single father, was facing jail time for unpaid child support. His ex had gone to court claiming he hadn't paid a dime in 2 years and that she was struggling because of it. She put on a whole show about how she was barely getting by, how their kids were suffering, and how he was a deadbeat dad. Except I had bank statements. My client had paid every single month. The payments had been going directly into the ex's account through automatic transfers. Even better, she had been withdrawing huge amounts in cash every month, right after receiving the payments. When I presented this, the judge's face darkened. He turned to her and asked, "Can you explain where this money went?" She stammered, tried to dodge the question, but it was too late. The judge not only dismissed the case, but referred her for an investigation into fraud. My client walked out a free man. I rest my case. Story 23. A man sued my client, a mechanic, claiming that my client had destroyed his luxury car's engine during a routine oil change. He demanded the full cost of a new engine, nearly $20,000. The plaintiff even brought in a mechanic expert who testified that my client had used the wrong oil and that it had caused catastrophic engine failure. But here's what they didn't know. I had already pulled the car's service history. The real reason the engine failed? The plaintiff had ignored every single maintenance warning for over a year. The car had been running with no oil for thousands of miles. My client's shop had actually told him the engine was already damaged and recommended immediate repairs. He refused, drove off, and then, surprise, his engine blew up a week later. When I presented this in court, the plaintiff's face turned ghost white. His expert suddenly had nothing to say. Case dismissed. I rest my case. Story 24. A landlord sued my elderly client for damaging the apartment she had lived in for 15 years, trying to keep her security deposit and charge her even more for repairs. He claimed she had trashed the place, showing pictures of holes in the walls, broken tiles, and missing fixtures. Sounds bad, right? Except there was one tiny issue. The pictures weren't of her apartment. I requested the maintenance records for the entire building. Guess what? The damages were from a completely different unit that had been renovated years ago. The landlord had just recycled the pictures thinking no one would notice. When I called him out on it in court, he tried to backtrack. The judge was not amused. Not only was my client awarded her full deposit back, but the judge also ordered the landlord to pay her triple damages for trying to scam her. I rest my case. Story 25. A big company tried to screw over my client, a small-time inventor. He had developed a piece of tech and entered a partnership with them. But once they had his blueprints, they cut him out, claiming he had no legal claim to the intellectual property. They had high-priced lawyers and thought they could just drown him in legal fees until he gave up. What they didn't realize was that my client had saved every email. And in those emails, clear, undeniable proof that the company had agreed in writing to share profits, that they had acknowledged he was the sole creator, and, best of all, a message from their own legal team stating, "We need to find a way to get rid of him without triggering a lawsuit." Oops, I presented everything in court. Their lawyers went silent. The judge took one look at the emails and ordered an immediate settlement discussion. My client walked away with millions. I rest my case. Story 26. I was representing a homeowner who was being sued by their neighbor over a property dispute. The neighbor claimed that my client had built a fence that encroached several feet into his yard and demanded it be torn down, plus financial damages. He was loud, aggressive, and had even threatened legal action before we got to court. Then came the fun part. I pulled out the official property survey, which showed that not only was the fence entirely on my client's land, but the neighbor's shed was actually encroaching onto my client's property by about 2 feet. When I presented this in court, the judge looked at the neighbor and asked, "So, would you like to continue with your lawsuit, knowing that I could just as easily rule that you need to remove your shed?" The neighbor turned beet red, mumbled something about misunderstanding the measurements, and withdrew his case on the spot. I rest my case. Story 27. A woman came to me after being fired for performance issues. Her employer insisted that she had been warned multiple times, but they had no written documentation, just their word against hers. She was devastated. She had been with the company for 10 years, always had great performance reviews, and suddenly she was out of a job. Something felt off, so I dug deeper. Turned out, she had recently reported her boss for sexual harassment. 2 weeks later, fired. The best part? We got a hold of company emails where HR had explicitly discussed how to get rid of her to avoid a lawsuit. One email even read, "We need to build a case against her before she files anything against us." We didn't just sue for wrongful termination. We sued for retaliation and discrimination. The company settled for a very large sum. I rest my case. Story 28. A man was suing my client, claiming that she had stolen his dog. He had a sob story about how she had kidnapped his beloved pet, how he had been heartbroken, and how he just wanted his furry friend back. Except, the dog was never his to begin with. I had veterinary records proving that my client had adopted the dog from a shelter years before the plaintiff even met her. Even better, the dog was microchipped, and the chip had my client's name on it. When I presented this evidence, the judge turned to the plaintiff and asked, "Would you like to explain why you thought you owned this dog?" Turns out, he was just mad that my client had broken up with him and was trying to make her life miserable. Case dismissed. My client kept her dog. I rest my case. Story 29. My client, a retired veteran, was being harassed by a debt collection agency over a loan he never took out. They were aggressive, calling him daily, threatening legal action, even trying to garnish his VA benefits. He was sure it was a mistake, so I started digging. And oh, did I find something? Not only was the loan fraudulent, but the debt collection agency knew it. They had been caught in a similar scam before, where they would try to intimidate people into paying debts that never existed. I gathered all the evidence, took them to court, and didn't just get my client's debt erased, we sued them for harassment and fraudulent practices. The agency ended up paying a hefty settlement, and my client never heard from them again. I rest my case. Story 30. A CEO of a large company was on trial for insider trading. He swore up and down that he had no knowledge of the stock trades in question and that it was all a misunderstanding. His lawyers argued that he wasn't involved, that the transactions were done by an independent broker, and that he was being unfairly targeted. Then I pulled out his text messages, specifically the one where he told his friend, "Sell everything before they announce the merger." This stays between us. There was complete silence in the courtroom. His lawyer looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. The CEO tried to stammer out an explanation, but the judge wasn't having it. Guilty verdict. I rest my case. Story 31. I represented an elderly couple who were being threatened with eviction from the home they had lived in for over 30 years. Their landlord had recently sold the building to a real estate developer, and suddenly they were being accused of violating their lease, something about unauthorized modifications. The modifications they were accused of? A grab bar in the bathroom and a small wheelchair ramp at the entrance, both installed by the landlord himself years ago as part of a disability accommodation. The landlord's new lawyer smugly presented a notice stating that the modifications compromised the structural integrity of the building and demanded their immediate removal or eviction. Then I pulled out the original lease agreement, which included a signed amendment by the previous landlord, explicitly allowing those modifications permanently. Even better, I had emails from the old landlord saying that the modifications had actually increased the value of the property. When I presented all this, the judge sighed and turned to the landlord's lawyer, saying, "Did your client actually read the lease before filing this case?" They tried to withdraw the case, but it was too late. The judge not only ruled in my client's favor, but also ordered the landlord to pay them damages for undue stress. I rest my case. Story 32. A woman hired me after being sued by her ex-boyfriend, who claimed she had stolen $20,000 from their shared account after they broke up. He presented bank statements showing large withdrawals and claimed she had emptied the account to punish him. But there was just one problem. The bank statements he provided had been doctored. I obtained the official bank records, which showed that he had made the withdrawals himself and then tried to make it look like she had done it. Even better, we pulled security footage from the bank that showed him walking into the branch, withdrawing the money, and then walking out alone. When I presented the footage in court, he turned bright red and started mumbling about how it was all a misunderstanding. The judge ruled in my client's favor immediately and referred the ex-boyfriend for attempted fraud. I rest my case. Story 33. A teenager was charged with grand theft auto after a wealthy man accused him of stealing his luxury sports car. The prosecution had surveillance footage showing a very similar-looking young man driving off in the stolen car. They claimed it was clear as day that my client was guilty. The problem? My client had never driven a car in his life. He didn't even have a license. I had his school attendance records, which showed that at the exact time of the theft, he was sitting in class taking an exam. Even better, the actual thief was later caught trying to sell the car, and he looked shockingly similar to my client. In court, I played side-by-side footage of my client and the real thief. The resemblance was uncanny, but the key difference? The thief had a tattoo on his arm that my client didn't have. The case was thrown out immediately, and the judge apologized to my client for the wrongful accusation. I rest my case. Story 34. A man sued my client for medical malpractice, claiming that a routine surgery had left him permanently disabled. He brought in a flashy expert witness who confidently declared that the surgery was clearly botched and that my client was responsible for the alleged harm. Then I cross-examined the expert. I casually asked him when he had last reviewed the plaintiff's actual medical records. He stammered and admitted he hadn't seen them at all. Then I pulled out those records which showed the plaintiff had been diagnosed with his disability 5 years before my client had even met him. The judge dismissed the case on the spot. The plaintiff's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. I rest my case. Story 35. A wealthy businessman was suing a small-time contractor for botching a home renovation job and demanded triple the cost of the project in damages. The businessman claimed the contractor had used cheap materials, ignored blueprints, and caused irreversible structural damage. Then I got my hands on the actual blueprints and invoices. Turns out, the businessman had changed the plans mid-project, demanded cheaper materials to save money, and then personally signed off on every single modification. Even better, I found a text from him to the contractor that said, "Just make it look good for now. I'll deal with any problems later." When I presented this in court, the judge turned to the businessman and asked, "Why are you suing someone for following your own instructions?" The case was immediately dismissed, and the businessman was ordered to pay the contractor's legal fees. I rest my case. Story 36. I defended a small cafe owner being sued by a former customer who claimed she had suffered severe food poisoning after eating there. She was asking for a huge payout, saying she had been hospitalized for days and was still dealing with the effects. She came to court with hospital records that showed she had indeed been treated for food poisoning. Sounded bad, until I got a closer look at the records. Turns out, she had been treated for shellfish poisoning. My client's cafe was vegan. They didn't serve anything even remotely close to seafood. When I presented this, the judge turned to her and asked, "So, where exactly did you eat this shellfish?" She tried to backtrack, mumbling about cross-contamination, but it was too late. The case was thrown out, and she was warned against filing fraudulent claims in the future. I rest my case. Story 37. A father was fighting for custody of his daughter after his ex-wife had painted him as an abusive, neglectful parent. She had managed to gain full custody by claiming he was never involved and didn't care about their child's well-being. But she made one mistake. She left a long digital trail. I pulled social media posts, text messages, and emails showing that my client had been actively involved in his daughter's life. Pictures of him attending school events, medical records showing he had taken her to doctor's appointments, and even messages from his ex thanking him for being such a good father. Then came the kicker. I found an email where she wrote to a friend, "I don't actually think he's a bad dad. I just don't want to share custody." When I presented this in court, the judge immediately reversed custody, granting my client equal parenting time. I rest my case. Story 38. A man was being sued for breach of contract by his former business partner, who claimed my client had failed to deliver on a project and owed him hundreds of thousands in damages. The contract, according to the plaintiff, was ironclad. But there was just one problem. The contract he presented was a complete forgery. I had my client's original contract, and not only was it different from the one submitted in court, but I was also able to prove that the plaintiff had manually edited the document. He had literally changed key terms to make it look like my client owed him money. Even better, I found metadata from the digital file showing exactly when and how he had edited it. When I presented this, the judge was furious. The case wasn't just dismissed. The plaintiff was referred for fraud charges. I rest my case. Story 39. My client was accused of assault. A fight had broken out at a bar, and the alleged victim swore up and down that my client had thrown the first punch, causing serious injury. The prosecution had witnesses who all pointed at my client as the aggressor. It looked like an open and shut case. Then I got my hands on the bar's security footage. The video showed that not only had my client never thrown a punch, but the victim had actually started the fight himself and was the one throwing punches at multiple people. My client had only defended himself. When I played the footage in court, the prosecution's case fell apart in an instant. The judge dismissed the charges and even reprimanded the victim for lying under oath. I rest my case. Story 40. A high-profile executive was being sued by a former assistant who claimed she had been fired for refusing his inappropriate advances. She had detailed text messages, emails, and even voicemails where he supposedly harassed her. It looked bad, until I asked a simple question. Can we verify where these messages came from? A forensic expert analyzed the messages, and guess what? They were completely fake. She had edited text messages, fabricated emails, and even used voice-altering software to create the voicemails. When we confronted her with the forensic evidence, she broke down and admitted she had made everything up in hopes of a big settlement. The lawsuit was thrown out, and she was later charged with fraud. I rest my case. Story 41. A wealthy homeowner sued my client, a small landscaping company, claiming they had caused extensive damage to his yard while installing a new irrigation system. He demanded a six-figure settlement, claiming the system had been installed incorrectly and had flooded his property, destroying his expensive garden. But my client had receipts. Before we even got to court, I pulled up weather records for the area. The flooding had happened 2 days after my client finished the job, during a massive storm that had dumped nearly 6 inches of rain in one. Then I subpoenaed the homeowner's security camera footage, which clearly showed that his own drainage system had been clogged for months. The water had nowhere to go, and the flooding was entirely due to his neglect. When I presented this in court, the judge turned to him and asked, "Did you really think we wouldn't check the weather reports?" Case dismissed. My client kept his reputation intact, and the homeowner got nothing. I rest my case. Story 42. My client was a young teacher falsely accused of hitting a student. The school board fired her immediately, and she was facing a lawsuit from the child's parents. The student and his mother both swore she had slapped him during class, and several other students had been pressured into backing up the claim. But my client had a habit of recording her lessons for professional development, and on the day in question, the entire class had been recorded, with crystal clear audio and video. We played the footage in court. Not only was there no slap, but the student in question could actually be heard whispering to a friend, "Watch this, I'm gonna get her fired." The mother started yelling about how the video must have been edited, but the judge wasn't buying it. My client was reinstated with full back pay, and the school board had to issue a public apology. I rest my case. Story 43. A company was being sued by a former employee who claimed he was wrongfully fired for whistleblowing on illegal practices. He had a whole sob story about being punished for doing the right thing and wanted a huge payout. Except, there was no whistleblowing. I pulled the company's records and found that he had been fired for repeatedly stealing office supplies. And we're not talking about a few pens and sticky notes. This guy had been caught loading a printer into his car. Then, I dug a little deeper and found that he had tried this scam before, suing 2 previous employers for wrongful termination. When I presented all of this in court, the judge didn't even let his lawyer finish their argument before dismissing the case. I rest my case. Story 44. My client was a small business owner being sued by a customer who claimed she had suffered a severe allergic reaction after eating at his restaurant. She demanded a massive settlement, claiming that she had explicitly told the staff about her nut allergy and that they had ignored her. It sounded bad until we checked her social media. The night of the supposed reaction, she had posted a picture of herself eating dessert at another restaurant an hour after leaving my client's place. And the dessert? A peanut butter cheesecake. When I presented this in court, the judge looked at her and asked, "Are you allergic or not?" She immediately tried to drop the case. The judge didn't let her. She was later charged with fraud. I rest my case. Story 45. A man accused my client, a single mother, of hitting his car in a parking lot and driving away. He had dashcam footage showing her car leaving the parking space and a repair bill for thousands of dollars. It looked like an open and shut case, until I took a closer look at the footage. I noticed something odd. The damage was already there when my client pulled out. The dent in his car was visible before she even moved. Then I got surveillance footage from the parking lot, which showed him backing into a pole 10 minutes early. He had tried to frame my client to get his repair costs covered. When I presented this, the judge was furious. Not only was the case dismissed, but the man was hit with perjury charges. I rest my case. Story 46. I represented a father fighting for custody of his daughter against his ex-wife, who was claiming he was an unfit parent. She had a long list of accusations. He was irresponsible, never spent time with their child, and even had substance abuse issues. It sounded bad, until I dug deeper. First, I pulled his employment records. He had been working full-time and had never missed a child support payment. Then, I got school records showing that he was the one who attended every parent-teacher conference. Finally, I subpoenaed his medical records. He had never had a history of substance abuse. Then, I found the real kicker: her social media. She had been posting nonstop about her amazing new life, traveling from city to city, partying and dating multiple guys. Meanwhile, my client had been raising their child full-time, while she barely visited. When I presented all of this in court, the judge looked at her and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" She tried to backtrack, claiming the posts were just jokes, but the judge wasn't buying. My client was granted full custody. I rest my case. Story 47. A man sued my client, a plumber, claiming that he had done shoddy work, leading to a massive pipe burst that caused $50,000 in damages. The plaintiff had receipts, photos, and even a home inspection report stating that the work had been faulty. But here's where things fell apart. I requested the full inspection report. Turns out the plaintiff had edited. The original document actually said the pipes were old and corroded, with a recommendation to replace them immediately. Even worse, I found text messages from the plaintiff to his friend saying, "I told them not to replace the pipes. Now I'll make the plumber pay for the damages." When I presented this, the judge didn't just dismiss the case, he ordered the plaintiff to pay my client's legal fees. I rest my case. Story 48. A woman was being sued for breach of contract by a shady moving company. They claimed she had agreed to a set price for moving her belongings, but when they finished the job, she refused to pay the full amount. Except there was one problem. The contract they submitted was fake. My client had the original agreement, which showed a completely different price. Even better, she had recorded the movers trying to scam her by demanding extra money after they had already loaded up her belongings. When I played the recording in court, the movers started scrambling to explain themselves. The judge stopped them and ruled in my client's favor immediately. I rest my case. Story 49. A large company tried to sue my client, a software engineer, for stealing proprietary code after leaving their company to start his own business. They claimed that he had taken their intellectual property and used it for his startup, demanding millions in damages. But my client had written the code years before ever working for them. We pulled up old GitHub commits, timestamps, and emails showing that my client had been developing this software long before he was ever employed by them. Even better, I found an internal email where one of the executives admitted, "We know he wrote the code before working here, but we can tie him up in court and drain his resources." The judge was not impressed. The case was thrown out and the company was ordered to pay my client's legal fees. I rest my case. Story 50. A woman sued my client, a taxi driver, claiming he had overcharged her for a ride and even taken a longer route to rack up the fare. She claimed to have been a loyal customer and wanted a full refund plus damages for emotional distress. She thought it was going to be an easy win, but my client had dashcam footage. Not only did the footage show that he had taken the shortest route possible, but it also captured her bragging to a friend about how she was going to fake a complaint and get a free ride. When I played this in court, her lawyer immediately tried to withdraw the case. Too late. The judge not only dismissed it, but warned her that she could be charged with fraud. I rest my case. Story 51. A woman came to me after her boss fired her for violating company policy and then refused to pay her final paycheck. The company claimed she had improperly accessed confidential files and leaked them, leading to a breach of security. They were not only withholding her paycheck, but threatening legal action. It sounded serious until I asked to see the so-called leaked documents. Turns out the files in question were her own performance reviews and pay stubs. She had simply downloaded her own records from the HR portal. That was it. No leaks, no breach, just a desperate employer looking for an excuse to avoid paying her. Even better, I found emails from HR stating that they were using this as a tactic to make an example of her and scare other employees from demanding their rightful pay. When I presented this in court, the judge ordered the company to pay triple the withheld wages as a penalty for violating labor laws. I rest my case. Story 52. A wealthy landlord sued my client, a single mother, claiming she had trashed the apartment she rented and owed him thousands in repairs. He even had photos of the damages, holes in the walls, broken cabinets, and missing appliances. But here's the problem. The photos were from 3 years before she even moved in. I pulled up the property's maintenance records and found that those exact damages had been reported and fixed before my client ever lived. Then I found the real kicker. The landlord had used the same photos in a lawsuit against a different tenant 2 years earlier. When I presented all of this in court, the judge didn't just dismiss the case. He ordered the landlord to refund my client's full security deposit and fined him for attempting fraud. I rest my case. Story 53. A woman sued my client, a jewelry shop owner, claiming he had sold her a fake diamond engagement ring. She claimed she had the ring appraised and was devastated to find out it was just a piece of cheap glass. She wanted a full refund plus damages for emotional distress. Sounds bad, right? Except I had the original sales receipt, which showed that she had purchased a cubic zirconia ring, not a diamond. It was clearly marked on the paperwork. Then I pulled her own text messages where she told a friend, "I told him it was real so I could get more money out of him." When I presented this, the judge dismissed her case immediately and warned her against attempting fraud. I rest my case. Story 54. A man was suing my client, a mechanic, claiming he had destroyed his car's engine by using the wrong oil. The plaintiff demanded that my client pay for a full engine replacement, claiming his car had been running fine before the service. I requested his service history. Not only had the car already had severe engine issues before my client ever touched it, but I also found out that the plaintiff had been told by 2 previous mechanics that the engine needed replacement due to lack of maintenance. Even better? I pulled up dash cam footage from another mechanic's shop that captured the plaintiff saying, "I'm just going to blame the last guy and make him pay for it." When I played this in court, his case collapsed. The judge dismissed the claim and ordered him to pay my client's legal fees. I rest my case. Story 55. A man tried to sue my client, a wedding photographer, for failing to deliver satisfactory pictures of his wedding. He claimed my client had ruined his special day and demanded a full refund plus damages for emotional distress. But my client had every single email and contract. The agreement clearly stated that he had received all the photos and even approved them. Then came the kicker. I found an email where he wrote, "These are the best wedding photos I've ever seen." Even better, he had already used the pictures on social media, bragging about how perfect his wedding was. When I presented this in court, the judge asked, "So are these the best wedding photos you've ever seen? Or are they so bad you need a refund?" Case dismissed. I rest my case. Story 56. A woman was suing my client, a small moving company, claiming that their workers had stolen thousands of dollars worth of jewelry during her move. She demanded full reimbursement and damages for emotional distress. She had a detailed list of the missing items, claimed she had stored them safely in a jewelry box, and swore they had disappeared after the movers left. She even had receipts proving the jewelry's worth. Sounded convincing until I asked her one simple question. "Did you file a police report?" She stammered. She hadn't. Then I pulled up her home security footage. It showed her packing the jewelry into her personal bag, which she then took with her in her car before the movers even arrived. When I played the footage in court, the judge dismissed her case instantly and referred her for attempted fraud charges. I rest my case. Story 57. My client, a software developer, was being sued by a former employer who claimed he had stolen company secrets and used them to start his own business. They demanded he shut down his company and pay damages for intellectual property theft. They even had an expert witness who testified that my client's software was identical to theirs. Except, I had a surprise for them. I presented my client's time-stamped development logs, showing that he had started writing his software months before he even joined their company. Then I pulled up his GitHub repository, publicly available code that predated anything the company had ever produced. The judge looked at their expert witness and asked, "Did you actually analyze the code before testifying?" The witness stammered. The case collapsed. I rest my case. Story 58. A man was suing my client, a dog, claiming that she had injured his dog during a grooming session, causing emotional trauma and high vet bills. He showed pictures of the dog with a bandaged leg and claimed the groomer had cut too deep. But my client kept before and after pictures of every pet she groomed. And guess what? The dog was completely fine when it left her shop. No injuries, no cuts, nothing. Then I pulled up vet records. The dog had actually been treated for the leg injury 2 weeks before the grooming appointment. When I showed this in court, the man suddenly forgot when the injury had happened. The judge dismissed the case and warned him about filing false claims. I rest my case. Story 59. A landlord sued my client, claiming she owed 6 months of unpaid rent and demanded immediate eviction. The landlord had records showing missed payments and had already lined up a new tenant. But my client had bank statements showing she had paid every month, on time, directly into the landlord's account. Then came the real kicker. I pulled up emails from the landlord where he was bragging to a friend about finding a loophole to get rid of his current tenant so he could charge more rent to the new one. When I presented this, the judge didn't just dismiss the case. He ordered the landlord to pay my client damages for wrongful eviction attempts. I rest my case. Story 60. A man tried to sue my client, a personal chef, claiming that her food had given him food poisoning and caused him to miss work. He demanded lost wages and damages. His argument? He had eaten one of her meals and immediately felt sick. But then I asked him, "What else did you eat that day?" He hesitated. I had already pulled his social media posts. That same day, he had posted a picture of himself eating raw oysters at a seafood restaurant, right before he claimed my client's food made him sick. When I presented this, the judge dismissed the case instantly. I rest my case.